It was 1986. The fog hung heavy over the outskirts of Millfield, a forgotten little town buried deep within the damp woods and gravel roads of rural Ohio. The kind of place where the trees whispered old secrets and the streetlights flickered as if resisting the wind's wrath. That night, the storm had swallowed the sky whole. Thunder rumbled like distant cannon fire, and the power had been out for hours. Homes glowed weakly with candlelight, and flashlights danced like fireflies behind drawn curtains. Near the edge of the old Route 7, where rust overtook everything that had once mattered, stood a phone booth, dented, neglected, nearly consumed by creeping vines. No one used it anymore, not since landlines became common. But tonight, under the rain's relentless drumming, that booth began to ring. Not once, not twice, but over and over, shrill and demanding, slicing through the sound of the storm like a scream trapped in glass. 16-year-old Julie Carmichael was walking home from her best friend's house. She was soaked to the bone, clutching her denim jacket around her like armor, trying to keep her diary dry under one arm. The streets were empty, only the echo of water hitting pavement and the constant ring that came from the direction of the booth. She stopped under a loose tin awning, hesitated, then turned toward the sound. Every instinct told her to ignore it, but something else, something deeper, unspoken, drew her forward. As she reached the booth, the cracked acrylic door creaked open with a sound like bones shifting. The receiver was cold in her hand. Her breath fogged the glass. Then came the voice, not hers, not anyone she knew. It was low, rasping, and mechanical, like a cassette tape damaged by time. "You're wearing a blue sweater, and you're holding your diary under your arm. Why do you still write about him, Julie?" Her chest tightened. Her mouth went dry. That voice, it wasn't asking, it was stating. And that question, about him, stabbed deep into a place she hadn't let anyone near. Not in years. Nobody knew what was in that diary. Nobody. Her eyes darted around, scanning the street, but there was only the storm and the dim halo of a flickering lamppost 20 yards away. And beneath that yellow glow, barely visible through the curtain of rain, was a figure, still, watching. The shape of a man, or something like one, wrapped in shadows and soaked silence. A gust of wind slammed against the booth, jolting Julie back. The line crackled, then went dead. The silence was worse than the voice. Her fingers trembled as she lowered the receiver. But before it even touched the cradle, the phone rang again. This time, louder. And now, it wouldn't stop. Julie bolted from the booth, her footsteps slapping wet against the pavement as she sprinted through the storm toward the only house nearby with a flicker of familiarity. Her old English teacher's, Miss Morgan. The white clapboard structure loomed like a ghost in the rain, its porch light extinguished, windows blackened as if the world inside had gone still. Julie banged on the door, called out, pressed her face to the glass. Nothing. The silence inside was not the silence of sleep. It was the kind that felt intentional, heavy, artificial, the kind that held its breath, as if the house itself didn't want to be seen. Julie stepped back, drenched and shaking. She turned, letting her eyes fall once more toward the road, toward the booth. Her heart dropped. The booth door was closed, but she hadn't shut it. She was sure she hadn't. The cracked pane, which she'd left swaying in the wind, now stood still, sealed, like someone had stepped in right behind her and took her place. Then it rang again. But this time, the sound wasn't sharp and piercing. It was muffled, warped, like it had tunneled through a mile of flesh before reaching her. The sound didn't come from the booth anymore. It came from inside her head, a low, echoing tone that pulsed behind her eyes, vibrating her skull. She clutched her temples, staggered back, and looked up as lightning slashed across the sky. The street lit up for a fraction of a second, and she saw them. Figures, dozens of them, lurking in the periphery. Each flash brought a change. A red bicycle that had been lying in the grass was now standing upright, its wheels slowly turning. A doll she hadn't seen since she was 5 sat on the sidewalk, smiling with a cracked porcelain grin. A mailbox, once opened, was now closed. Time wasn't just shifting, it was rewinding, but not in the right order. When she answered again, because she had to, the voice was different, stronger. No longer curious, but certain. "It's clearer now, isn't it? I told you, you never left. The rain doesn't wake you because you never went to sleep." Julie cried out, begged for help, screamed into the storm, but the sound that came from the receiver wasn't her voice. It was her own scream, repeated back to her, distorted, stretched like melted tape, then whispered in a tone that was too calm, too slow, too wrong. Every plea became a cruel mimicry, each call more invasive, each word more precise. The voice spoke of memories she had buried, fears she never told anyone. It knew her, or worse, it was her. And as she stumbled back from the booth again, trying to catch her breath, she realized something that turned her blood to ice. The booth wasn't where it had been. It had moved. It was closer to her house, closer than it should have been, like it was following, watching, and waiting to be answered again. Julie finally reached her house, heart thundering, lungs burning, her soaked sneakers squelching against the wooden porch. The key trembled in her hand as she unlocked the front door. Inside, everything was still, too still. The type of stillness that hums beneath the surface like the moment before a scream. At first glance, it looked like home. The walls, the furniture, the smell of old books and lavender detergent. But something was wrong. Subtle things. The Christmas photo hanging above the hallway light was the same as always. Her parents, the dog they lost 2 years ago. But her father was wearing a brown sweater. She remembered it being green. The picture was familiar, but off, edited, as if reality had been rewritten with a trembling hand. Her bedroom door was ajar, but she always locked it. Always. Especially during storms. She crept in, eyes darting across every shadow, every corner. Nothing. Just silence and the steady drip of her soaked clothes on the floor. Then she saw it, sitting on the nightstand beside her lamp. A folded paper, water damaged at the edges. She opened it with trembling fingers. It was a phone bill. Last month's. Routine. Unimportant. Until she scanned the numbers. The booth's number, a long-forgotten line she hadn't seen dialed in years, appeared. Again and again. Incoming and outgoing. All from inside her own house. Each timestamp lined up perfectly with the moments she had heard it ringing. With the nights she had dreamed about that voice, but never remembered. With the days she had woken up too tired, too hollow, like something had borrowed her skin while she slept. Her breath caught in her throat. She turned slowly toward the living room. On the far table, the red light on the landline blinked. A message. Just one. She pressed play. Static. Then her own voice screaming for help. Word for word, exactly as she had earlier that night. Followed by laughter, soft, distant, familiar, like someone impersonating a memory. And then came the last phrase, whispered like a secret already known. She still thinks it's real. She still thinks she can wake up. Julie dropped the receiver. The air shifted, thickened. She spun toward the window, but the rain was gone. The thunder was gone. There were no more flickering street lamps, no howling wind. Outside no longer existed. Just void. When she turned back toward the living room, her knees buckled. The booth. The same rusted booth, with its glass cracked and its phone dangling. It stood now at the center of her home, where the couch should have been, where her family portrait used to hang, like it had always been there. The phone began to ring, a slow, deliberate chime that echoed from nowhere and everywhere. The voice came next, not from the booth, but from the walls, the floor, the spaces behind her eyes, calm, cold, and waiting. Want to try again? The storm raged through Salem's Hollow, a quiet, rural town where lightning crackled in the sky like a cruel warning. The wind howled fiercely, and the rain pounded relentlessly against the windows of every house. Amidst the chaos, the lights flickered and then died, plunging the town into darkness. In the midst of it, two siblings, Lily and Ethan, found themselves seeking shelter in the attic of their late grandmother's house. The house, which had stood empty since her passing, seemed to harbor an eerie silence, broken only by the sounds of the storm outside. The attic was a place of forgotten memories, filled with old furniture draped in dusty sheets and boxes piled high, each one holding pieces of their family's history. The scent of aged wood and a faint mustiness clung to the air, reminding them of their childhood visits to this very room. The attic was always a place of curiosity and mystery for the two siblings, but tonight it felt different, more oppressive, as if the storm outside had infused the house with an unnatural heaviness. As they ventured deeper into the attic, their eyes adjusting to the dim light of a single flickering candle, Ethan's foot kicked something, sending a cloud of dust into the air. It was a box, slightly ajar, with a tattered label on the side. Inside, they found a relic from a past they barely remembered, an old cassette tape recorder. Its once sleek design had become aged and worn, the tape inside brittle and frayed. The wires were exposed, and the device had clearly seen better days. But something about it intrigued Lily, who in a moment of pure curiosity decided to power it up. With hesitant fingers, she pressed the play button. The whir of the tape spinning began, and a muffled, distorted sound filled the attic. The voice that emerged was low and gravelly, like it had traveled through time and space to reach them. It wasn't just a voice, it was a desperate, tortured plea. The recording told a strange and unsettling story about an ancient entity, one that thrived on the fear and despair of humans, feeding off the echoes of their suffering. The entity, the voice explained, was drawn to the sound of rain, specifically the sound of water, which seemed to empower it, allowing it to move through the shadows of the town. The voice in the recording described how, every time a storm hit, someone in the town would vanish, taken by this malevolent presence. The storm outside intensified as the tape continued to play, the thunder crashing louder and louder, as if in response to the words of the tape. The air in the attic grew thick, heavy with an oppressive energy that made Lily and Ethan uneasy. As the wind rattled the windows and the rain lashed against the roof, a sense of dread settled over them. They were not just listening to a story, they were hearing a warning. The siblings exchanged a glance, their unease growing as they realized that the storm they were experiencing tonight felt eerily different from the ones they had endured before. It wasn't just the power outage or the unrelenting wind. Something about the storm felt unnatural, as though it was directly linked to the dark entity described on the tape. The wind howled louder, and another bolt of lightning illuminated the broken window. The shadows in the attic seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally, their shapes shifting like the fingers of some unseen force reaching out. The voice on the cassette continued, its tone growing more frantic, warning them that the storm had come again. And with it, the entity was drawing closer. As the storm raged outside, Lily and Ethan sat in the cold, dim attic, unable to tear themselves away from the tape recorder. The distorted voice of the woman on the cassette grew more urgent, her words weaving a chilling tale of terror from the past. Each click and whir of the recorder seemed to pull them deeper into the story, blurring the line between the present and the long-buried history of the town. The narration was no longer just a warning. It was a recounting of horrors that had struck Salem's Hollow in 1979 during a storm far worse than anything they had ever experienced. The voice on the tape became clearer, the static slowly dissipating as it retold the events of that fateful night. The woman spoke of an entity, a creature that moved with the rhythm of the rain, its presence only detectable by the eerie sound of water tapping against the earth. But what struck the siblings the most was the way she described the terror that gripped the town as the storm tore through it. People had vanished without a trace, disappearing from the streets as the rain began to fall. Those who had been caught outside in the storm had been taken by the creature, their screams swallowed by the relentless storm, leaving no clue as to where they had gone. Witnesses described hearing the screams, but no one could say from where they had come. The sound seemed to echo from all directions, coming from the very heart of the storm. It was as if the rain itself was alive, guiding the creature through the streets, devouring the cries of its victims. The woman's voice grew frantic as she explained that the entity fed on fear, on the screams of those it took, and with every storm, it grew stronger. As the tape played on, the siblings began to realize that the woman narrating the events was not just a bystander or a witness. She was a survivor. The tape was her testimony, one of the few remaining accounts of what had happened. And as the story unfolded, the siblings were struck by the unsettling realization that their own grandmother had been involved in the events of that night. Their grandmother, who had passed away recently, had somehow survived the storm, and her involvement with the mysterious disappearances was more profound than they could have imagined. According to the tape, she had been one of the very few who had lived through the horrors of that night, escaping the wrath of the entity that had claimed so many lives. The revelation shook them to their core. The voice on the tape spoke of their grandmother's desperate fight to survive, and how, in the aftermath, the town had been left to pick up the pieces of a tragedy that no one could fully explain. Disappearances continued for years after the storm, and the town became a place of whispered rumors and uneasy glances. The very land beneath their feet seemed to carry the weight of those lost souls, and as the siblings listened in stunned silence, they realized that the storm they were enduring now, the one that had brought them back to this attic, was no ordinary storm. It was a harbinger. The entity had returned. The cursed events of 1979 had come to life once again. As the storm intensified outside, so did the sense of dread that consumed Lily and Ethan. The howling wind battered against the old house, and the heavy rainfall seemed to grow louder with each passing moment. The air in the attic felt thick, oppressive, as if the very space was holding its breath. They exchanged nervous glances, the weight of the tape's revelations sinking in deeper with every drop of rain that hit the roof. Something wasn't right. They had heard the warnings in the woman's voice, but now they could feel it. The disappearances, the terror. It was happening again. Salem's Hollow was being devoured by the same darkness that had struck in 1979, and the brothers could no longer ignore the growing fear inside them. The storm was no ordinary storm, they realized. It was the harbinger of the entity's return. Each thunderclap echoed like the entity's voice, each flash of lightning like a reminder of the horrors that had come before. The recordings they had listened to, the chilling words of their grandmother, were not just warnings. They were part of the very cycle that bound the town to the creature's curse. The entity had been dormant for years, but it had awoken once more. The same fear, the same darkness, was taking root in Salem's Hollow again. And with every passing moment, the siblings knew they couldn't sit idly by. They had to act. As they searched through the rest of the tapes, their hands trembling with urgency, they uncovered the final revelation, the last part of the recording, made by their grandmother herself before she had passed away. It was a desperate plea, a confession of the terrible burden she had carried all these years. In it, she spoke of the ancient prayer, a ritualistic chant that had been used in forgotten times to ward off the creature. The prayer, she explained, had been passed down through generations, a last line of defense against the entity's power. But there was a catch. To use the prayer, one had to face their deepest fears, call out the creature's name, and speak the words aloud. Doing so would bind the entity, but it came with a price. The risk was unimaginable, for it was unclear whether the prayer would banish the creature, or whether it would unleash something far worse. The fear in her voice was unmistakable, and for the first time, Lily and Ethan understood the true danger they faced. The room seemed to close in around them as they realized the gravity of their situation. The storm outside was no longer just a storm. It was a countdown, a signal that the entity was growing closer with every flash of lightning. The tape recorder, once a mere object from the past, now felt like an ominous connection to the present. It was as if the creature could feel the vibrations of the words as they played, as if the storm was not just a natural occurrence, but the living manifestation of the entity itself, reaching out through time. They couldn't ignore the truth any longer. The storm had come back, and with it, the same malevolent force that had taken so many lives. The brothers now had only one choice. They had to perform the prayer. But as they prepared to face the creature, they were struck by a terrifying realization. Performing the prayer might not just be the end of the entity's reign. It might be the beginning of something far more horrifying. The thunder crashed one last time, and for a split second, everything went silent. Then, in the stillness that followed, they heard it, the unmistakable sound of something moving outside. It was coming for them. In the Ironbound neighborhood of Newark, New Jersey, the streets didn't just crack under time, they whispered secrets. The pavement was split like old scars, and every flicker of the dim, flickering street lamps felt less like a power issue and more like the city trying to forget what it had witnessed. Between rusted train tracks and rows of abandoned warehouses, the air carried the weight of stories no one wanted to repeat. It was here, in the forgotten veins of the city, that the legend was born. Older residents spoke with trembling voices of a figure who appeared only during heavy storms, silent, motionless, and soaked to the bone. A man draped in a gray raincoat, his face hidden beneath the brim of a sagging hat, always standing still at the same flooded corners. No footsteps, just a dragging sound, metal scraping across wet asphalt, as if something was trapped inside the sack he carried over his shoulder. And always, without exception, someone went missing after he was seen. It was the summer of 1987, when the rain just wouldn't stop. The skies hung low over Ironbound like a soaked blanket, and thunder rumbled more often than traffic did. That was when four friends, Sean, Mike, Tyler, and Jaden, first heard the story. They were huddled near the neon buzz of Manny's Diner, eating fries and daring each other to steal a street sign, when an old man, hunched and slurring his words, began to speak. He told them not to laugh, not to be loud, and never to be outside when the thunder rolled 3 times in a row. That's when he came, the man in the gray coat. The kids laughed, not because it was funny, but because fear always comes out crooked at that age, half smile, half denial. But even as they laughed, something in them tightened. They looked at each other a little longer than usual, and the next night, when the rain returned heavier than before, none of them noticed how empty the streets had become. Not one soul, not even the barking dogs. In Ironbound, when it rains, you go home, because when the man in the gray coat appears, it's never just weather, it's a warning. Night draped over Ironbound like a soaked curtain, thick and absolute, muting the world beneath it. The rain came down in sheets, so relentless, it seemed like it was trying to scrub the city away brick by brick. Inside Tyler's dim garage, lit only by shaky flashlights and the soft hum of a dying radio, 3 boys sat huddled around a cluttered table. Their map was a torn city flyer, scribbled over with red circles and arrows, and their courage was the kind that only comes from boredom, restlessness, and the sharp thrill of chasing a ghost. They talked about going to the old intersection where the gray-coated man had been spotted years ago, an abandoned crossroad near the scrapyard, forgotten by everyone except the stories that kept it alive. But when the time came, only Mike showed up. The others had hesitated, making excuses as the rain thickened. Mike had shrugged, pulled his hoodie tight, and said he'd just take a quick walk, just to see, just to prove it wasn't real. He never came back. The police filed it as a runaway, a troubled kid from a bad neighborhood. No evidence, no leads, just another name lost in the system. But the boys knew better. They had seen it. The next morning, water stains in the shape of footprints clung to the concrete outside Tyler's house, but they didn't follow any direction. The prints didn't lead to a road or a trail. They stopped mid-sidewalk, like someone had walked a few paces without ever touching the ground. Trash cans along the alley were crushed inwards, not from a car or wind, but as if something heavy and deliberate had pressed them flat. That night, the sound came again, metal scraping against pavement, echoing from a side alley no one used, a dead end swallowed by shadows and vines. It was the sound from the story, the dragging of the sack. The boys stood in silence, flashlights off, breath held, because the truth had uncoiled itself at their feet. This wasn't a ghost story. It wasn't something people told just to scare kids. It was real. It had always been real, and Mike was just the first. They tried to run. Tyler was sent down south to his grandmother's house in rural South Carolina, where the skies were clearer and the air didn't smell like rust and old secrets. Jaden stopped leaving his house altogether, curtains drawn, phone off, watching the same VHS tapes on loop just to keep the silence out. Sean slept with the TV humming static and his desk chair jammed under the doorknob, the way you do when you don't trust the dark. But the rain didn't stop. It came in waves, loud, angry, endless, like the sky was warning them that leaving Ironbound didn't mean escaping. And then the names started showing up. First, scrawled in mud along the side of the school's gym wall, rough and smeared but unmistakable, Jaden. Then, days later, spray painted across the rusted rails of the train tracks, Sean. There were no witnesses, no cameras, just names appearing where no one should have been. The city didn't care. The adults had forgotten the legend, moved on, but the boys hadn't, because the next thing to come were the voices. It wasn't loud at first, just whispers, soft and damp, threading through the drip of water from broken gutters and cracked ceilings. like the sound was hiding inside the storm itself, waiting. They heard it most at night, a breath, a syllable. Then full names, pulled out slow and shivering, as if the storm had learned how to speak. One morning, Sean woke up and found his name written across the foggy bathroom mirror. No one had used the shower. The glass was bone dry. He wiped it once. It came back. The gray-coated man didn't care about distance. He didn't care about locked doors or turned off lights. The rain was his key, and once it started, it meant he was close. The sack dragged behind him like memory, heavy and full. He left no footprints, no shadows, only signs. The city had moved on, but he hadn't. And when the storm fell again over Ironbound, the man in the gray coat walked once more, searching for the names he hadn't yet crossed off.